Okay, let me paint you a picture. The year is 2019, and I just signed on to the biggest project I've taken since I started this company. It was the biggest payday, it was the biggest deal, I guess, but I was brought on to lead a large campaign for a brand through a big time agency. And I'm not gonna mention the name of the agency, but just know it was a big name brand agency with thousands of employees, the whole deal. And I was brought on to lead the campaign, to direct and edit and do a bunch of spots, essentially. It was kind of a big moment for me. And to be honest, the agency that hired me is the type of agency that I wanted this company to grow into. I wanted to be sort of a big time traditional creative agency. What I really ended up getting out of the whole project was a look under the hood of a big time agency like that and how they work and how they operate. And I'll just be honest, I hated what I saw. The entire client-facing apparatus, the folks on the agency side, seemed to exist just to manipulate the client. They were there to mystify the process and make everything feel complicated so the client had no choice. They could either approve delays, pay overages, or just, trust that this is how everything worked. All the energy got spent managing the client instead of making the work better or more collaborative. And it also just felt like a lot of it was the agency folks trying to convince the client that the work was great, as opposed to just letting them judge it for themselves. Now, I say this having been repelled by the experience, but in all honesty, it just opened my eyes to the fact that no one was really ill-intentioned along the way there. The system was built so that there was this kind of, it was just kind of the inevitable result. So I almost don't blame anybody. And I basically said to myself that that's not how I ever want to run my own shop. I ran away from it, really, which is what led us to where we are now, shifting from a campaign-based agency to the model that we have today, which is installing and operating embedded content teams for companies or brands. But it didn't happen overnight. It was a fairly long road of trial and error, and really one incredible client that changed the way that we do things completely. And I feel like I just have to add this in, but I understand that that is a much bigger company than I have or probably will ever have, right? Huge, big, mega agency. And credit where credit's due, they built a great business, they built a big business. It's just not the business that I want to build. It's not, my preference is different. That's all. Preference. Now, I'm gonna break down the model that we have today, but first, I just want to give you a sense of where we started. All right, so cut back to 2019 again. We'd been in business for 2 years at that point, and as much as I want to call it a company, it was just me. You're looking at them. The model was pretty typical. We would get business via RFPs or referrals, we'd make a proposal, get notes back, eventually get awarded the job, and then the budget and scope were locked in, and then we would get off and running and do the actual work. The goal here was to take on as many projects as possible. It was really like a volume game. Then you want to staff them accordingly with contractors, complete the project, and then move on. And I think this can be a good model for individual freelancers or people who plan to be billing themselves out against projects. And the real upside, or at least the dream which gets sold with this style of working is, it's all about flexibility. Flexibility. You get to manage your own schedule. You're your own boss. You don't report to anybody directly. And there is potentially uncapped financial upside versus, say, working somewhere in-house, right? You can make as much as you can. But when run in practice, there are actually lots of considerations which put strain on the business, which end up becoming a forcing mechanism, which pushes the business in a direction that's, often counter to the way that you want to do business. And it feels like it always leads back to what I experienced with that initial big time agency. It's like that saying from Batman, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. You're going to become that agency whether you like it or not. So what were the issues? First off, cash flow is a nightmare. You'd hire contractors, you'd pay those contractors, and honestly, it probably makes me bad at business, but I always made the conscious choice to pay contractors on time and not delay their payments until we got paid, mainly because I hated it when that would happen to me in the past. But as a result, we get paid net 30 after project completion, and projects, they always run long. So best case, you get 25% up front, and even that is on net 30 terms. But maybe there's, a milestone payout or something like 25% halfway through. But the net effect is you have to lay out cash 1 to 4 months before you actually see the final project payment. Another problem is that the tools for managing change on projects, I think, are bad tools. The reality is projects shift, scope creeps, timelines change. That's just par for the course. That is normal. But the only real recourse you have in that situation is billing overages. And honestly, I gotta confess, when I started, I didn't even know overages were a thing. I just assumed, like, call me naive, I just assumed fixed price meant fixed price. But as it turns out, overages are just an industry unspoken assumption. Quick side story here. I actually ended up quitting a different agency project after the first one, right at the very end of the project. After battling just a ton of changes and shifting scope, we were already a month beyond like the deadline that we had initially set. And I won't get into it, but it was wild. We were 3 months into the project and it literally had no resemblance to what we had initially signed on for. And to that point, I had spent most of my time just renegotiating the scope over and over again. Now, I passed it off to a friend, they finished it off, did a great job, but before I did, the agency producer that was working on it was just like, dude, just charge overages. But by that point, it was a project that, I never would have agreed to in the first place. And it's all love, but needless to say, I didn't understand we were supposed to be billing overages constantly to adapt to all the changes in scope and all the new requests. And really, my take was, that's just a bad way of doing business. It felt like we were being forced to operate like a budget airline with tons of hidden fees. Like, you pay for the cheap ticket and then you pay for every little thing along the way. I felt like a better way is just say it out loud. Like, this work is malleable, and then build around that. Let's not pretend that the scope is set in stone, but then bill over and over and over again when reality kicks in. Okay, problem number 3. All the incentives, it seems, are pointed in the wrong direction. Like, first, you're incentivized to take on more than you can handle because volume is the only growth lever that you have in that model. And that really leads to overload, burnout, and just every project becomes lower quality from a delivery standpoint. Like, you're just spread so thin that you're not delivering at the highest quality possible. And then also, like I mentioned, you're incentivized to charge overages because it's really the only project management leverage that you have when you're working that way. You're also incentivized to take longer because billing hours means more hours to make the economics work. And that was always counterintuitive to me because I'd rather pay more for something to be faster. And the last one, which nobody really tells you about, is you're incentivized to hire on availability and not talent. Like, the client expects responsiveness throughout, and you can't really build around, for instance, a brilliant editor who you can only bring on a couple days a week without, the budget exploding. So you settle on someone who might be, so-so, but they have more availability and they can be engaged on the project every day and for longer. Okay, the last problem I would note here is that nothing compounds. Every project essentially starts from zero. You have to relearn the brand or sub-brand, meet new stakeholders, have different approval chains. Nothing really transfers from project to project. Now, of course, you can get repeat business, which is great, and there are things that do transfer then, but that isn't always the case, and there is still a very clear separation between the client and the vendor, and you're definitely not getting all of the compounding effects. That all probably sounds pretty negative, and I swear I like to think of myself as a positive person and definitely an eternal optimist, but that was the system back then. And then everything changed. All right, now I gotta be honest. Changing the model was never some grand strategy. I wish I could say it was, but it didn't shift until I got the opportunity for a short-term contract doing social content with a single client. And as much as I would love to shower them with praise, I'm not gonna name the client, but hey, you know who you are. And it all started out with an agreement that we would have fixed billing, no overages, and a dedicated capacity for the account, meaning that we would be available and accessible like a member of their team. Those 2 small agreements right up front really rewired everything in a good way. Removing the overages removed the incentive to mystify everything. There was no games to play, and the engagement only survived if the work was good and we were able to effectively collaborate. It basically shifted client and our team to the same side of the table. That's really how I think about it. And then being dedicated instead of transactional, you kind of stop being the vendor and you start becoming part of the infrastructure for their team. You become part of the team. So good news, we ended up staying on after that initial test run, which ended up being myself and 2 other people that I had brought on to run the account with. And then as it kept renewing and the work expanded, the model really began to take shape. So here's what happened. First off, the cash flow flipped. We were able to get on a regular billing cadence and eventually pre-bill monthly and quarterly instead of having to float like 3 to 4 months worth of payroll expenses. That is huge. And this had all sorts of benefits, but The cash flow wasn't just for comfort. We were actually able to then start using it, putting it to use in the business. An example here was just using it to fund paid edit tests for sourcing new editors. Whereas previously we would be reviewing reels and looking at portfolios and all that stuff, now we were able to pay candidates to work inside of the system and really try them out. And we were able to evaluate 3 things at once: the quality of their work, their ability to operate within our workflow, and their attitude, which is huge. This created a bit of a positive flywheel effect, which was, steady work led to better people led to better outputs, which led to longer engagements, which then gave us the cash flow to do things like funding rounds of finding talent. Another game changer was getting to work closer day to day with the client and inside of their operations. This was in the days before Slack Connect, but we were able to set up a shared Slack workspace, and then we were able to bring them into it. And then they gave us access to their internal tools. We learned their brand guidelines, systems, all the approval flows, everything like that. And we also had weekly calls with various teams, and we could get better contextualized on the strategy, and we can get upstream of launches instead of reacting after the fact. Another huge benefit of this, maybe the biggest, is speed. When you're inside the building, speed isn't really like a special request. They don't have to rush. Everything isn't just a rush order. It just becomes the default. Communications get sharper. You're able to develop shorthand. You're able to work more collaboratively, and everything's sped along. And along the same lines of speed and hiring talent, everyone became client facing. The old model had these bottlenecks that, like, a single account manager was the choke point for all communication. Requests would come through them, answers and delivery would also come through them too, right? And this just leads to games of telephone, miscommunication, and having to recontextualize everything for anyone you need to work on something. The other thing is that one person then always has to be available. And if they aren't, the client has to wait. With the new model, because we could vet, hire, and onboard people aligned to the team, everybody became client facing. So you end up with familiar faces there every day, interacting directly with the client. And it just expands the surface area of availability and reliability, and it de-bottlenecks the whole flow. Another benefit was we could charge less for things, believe it or not. Like, production costs lost their markup. We still facilitated shoots, we would hire crews, we would manage the productions, but at cost and in a consultative way. Like, the retainer already covered us, so there was no need to extract margin at every chance. And the last big benefit was that we were able to compound our learnings over time. Every month, we would get to know the team better, we would get to know the brand better, and all that context, it compounds over time instead of just like evaporating. And this is really the exact opposite of the project model, where everything starts at square one every time. I feel like an embedded team in month 12 is fundamentally better than that same team in month 1. And the client only had to take the time and essentially bear the cost of onboarding or ramping up one time. So we took all of that and we built it into our model today. That's now how we work with all new clients. Fixed billing, no overages, a dedicated team that's inside the client's operations, transparent communications, shared context, shared workspaces even, and it compounds every month. And when I look back on that initial experience working with the big time agency, I can see the flaws in the system. Like, the incentives were off and there was just zero transparency. But at the same time, I'm not claiming to be some overly virtuous person here. I just think that a lot of that stuff gets worked out by changing the structure of the model. And where that old model felt very zero sum, this one feels positive sum. And I definitely prefer that. So anyways, that's all I got. That's how we arrived at this model. Hopefully this is helpful in some way. See ya.